It's been a long 7 days, even by Russia-Ukraine standards. Last week at this time, the talk was of Tomahawks. But instead of delivering missiles, Donald Trump gave a closed-door earful at the White House to Volodymyr Zelensky. Then there was going to be this mano a mano U.S.-Russia summit in Budapest. Now the tide has turned again. No summit. Instead, U.S. sanctions on Russia's top two oil companies. An announcement that's got China and India reviewing their orders of Russian imports. And the price of crude soaring. Why the about face from Washington? And is Vladimir Putin actually feeling the pinch? Ordinary Russians are feeling inflation and shortages. That's well documented. But do the elites of Moscow and St. Petersburg even know there's a war on? We'll ask about the current mindset there and about the reality at the front as Europe's bloodiest war in living memory grinds on, along with its steady diet of populist rhetoric and nuclear-sized threats. Today in the France 24 debate, when does Vladimir Putin feel the pinch? He was France's ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2024. Pierre Lévy, author in French of At the Heart of Russia at War. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Thanks as well to a former Moscow correspondent in a previous life, Craig Kapitas, Europe correspondent for Newsmax and the author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo. How are you?
Doing fine, Francois.
He resigned in protest against Vladimir Putin's special military operation. From Geneva, former Russian diplomat Boris Bondarev. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
And from Washington, Anna Borshashevskaya, fellow at the Washington Institute think tank, the author of Putin's War in Syria, Russian Foreign Policy and the Price of America's Absence. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
By the way, you can always listen, that's right, listen to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, shares in world oil prices have soared as those in Lukoil and Rosneft have tanked. The price of crude, by the way, on world markets up nearly 6% last time we checked. Too soon to say, though, if Donald Trump will enforce his latest sanctions on Russia, but certainly he's got the world's attention. Brian Quinn has more.
Hitting the Kremlin where it hurts, in the wallet. Wednesday saw President Donald Trump announce new U.S. sanctions on Russia's top two oil companies in a bid to force Moscow to end its war in Ukraine.
Look, these are tremendous sanctions. These are very big. Those are against their two big oil companies, and we hope that they won't be on for long. We hope that the war will be settled.
The latest measures target Russia's state-owned Rosneft and the privately owned Lukoil. Together, the two companies export 3.1 million barrels of crude per day, accounting for nearly half of all Russian oil production. Tax revenues from the oil and gas sector make up a quarter of Russia's federal budget. American individuals and companies are now banned from transactions with Rosneft and Lukoil. And while there are not yet specific secondary sanctions on other foreign countries or companies, the U.S. Treasury Department is warning that continuing to do business with them could result in being cut off from the American financial system. Previous rounds of U.S. sanctions had avoided such moves in an effort to prevent supply shocks and price spikes on global energy markets. India is Russia's #2 oil buyer after China. New Delhi was already reportedly planning significant import cuts following tariff threats from Trump. Top Indian refiners are now said to be preparing to sharply reduce or halt their purchases altogether. Analysts say that though Washington's latest sanctions are significant, Russian oil will likely still find its way to global markets.
It's not enough to just introduce sanctions and let them be, because Russia finds a way to circumvent them typically within 1-3 months. It varies. What sanctions can achieve successfully is limiting the resources available at in Putin's hands to continue this war.
Trump's move follows similar sanctions from the UK last week. The EU, meanwhile, has just announced its own new set of sanctions targeting Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers and banning imports of Russian liquefied natural gas.
And just before we go to our panel, let's cross to Europe editor Armin Georgian, who's at that EU summit in Brussels. Armin, what are the reactions to these sanctions by the United States on the two big Russian oil majors?
Well, it's definitely a different mood at this EU summit, Francois, compared to previous ones when Donald Trump was not on the same page as the EU. And you can really feel that in the way that Viktor Orban has behaved. He made a very low-key entrance late in the afternoon. Normally, he's somebody who makes waves early on at an EU summit, he grabs a lot of attention. This time it's been completely different. He arrived many hours after the opening of the summit, didn't talk to journalists, made a kind of slipped away basically into the huddle without talking to anybody. So a very diminished Viktor Orban, and I think it reflects the fact that basically his political friend Donald Trump has pulled the rug from under his feet by announcing these sanctions on Lukoil, which actually does provide oil to Hungary. So that now exposes Hungary to secondary sanctions at least, and I think this has kind of changed the dynamic of the EU summit when it comes to this whole question of sanctions. But there is a caveat. When you look at the 19th package of EU sanctions on Russia that has been approved, it is true that it's the first time that Russian liquefied natural gas, or LNG, has been targeted in this way, but it's a phased-in ban. So short-term contracts will have to stop within 6 months, but the longer-term LNG contracts with Russia will only end in 2027. So that's a pace that's been criticized by the Russia hawks. We heard from Lithuanian president, for example, Gitanas Nausėda, who is saying, you know, why is Russian oil still this sort of sacred cow? Of course, Lithuania was the first EU country to completely stop Russian gas imports. The other two Baltic states have made that same choice, but it's obviously difficult to get all EU countries on the same page on this Russian energy question. It always has been. And this year, we've still had a number of EU countries importing Russian energy. So, for example, not just Hungary and Slovakia, but also France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. So I think even when it comes to this latest package of sanctions, the 19th package, it's actually still quite a mixed bag.
Armin Georgian, thanks for that live update from the EU summit in Brussels. Pierre Lévy, this question of oil, when there was the full invasion of February 2022, we understood you couldn't overnight wean yourself off of Russian oil, and the EU continent was so dependent. Now it's almost 2026. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, if you look backwards, since 12th of February, I mean, the first official phone call between the two presidents, there has been a lot of development, a lot of words, and now it seems to me it's the first time that there is something really significant regarding oil and gas. But let me underline that much before there's been many debates among member states in the EU to decrease very significantly the dependency towards Russia. I remember, in 2022, 45% of the imports were coming from Russia in gas. Now it's 13%. And regarding oil, it was 26% in 22 and 3% now. And in fact, it seems to me quite normal to have this phasing out. And the target is by the end of 2026 to finish all imports from oil. So I think this is really very, very important if you keep in mind that about 40% of the Russian budget comes from oil and gas revenues.
Craig Kapitas, going from 26%, if I'm following your statistics here, 26% to 3% on natural gas, or is it the other way around, oil? 45 to 13%. Enough for Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, phasing in sanctions, unfortunately, Mr. Ambassador, phases me out. This is more performative chaos that's going on here. What is the end game here? As they say in the diplomatic world, what are the deliverables? Is the deliverable the end of the war in Ukraine, with Ukraine either joining NATO or becoming part of EU? Or is it the overthrow of Putin? Or is it both? Can you have one without the other? Now, you started the show tonight with, I think, which was the lead, saying that the French Army Chief of Staff has said to prepare for a direct confrontation with Russia in 3 to 4 years. I agree with that assessment. And I think that all of this discussion about sanctions and oil is performative chaos, because Putin is going to get whatever oil he wants sold however he wants. He's going to undercut the world price. He's going to get it to them on the the spooky tankers that you're talking about. And finally, if Trump and Europe were really, really serious about this, they would go out and interdict or sink the 1,400 ghost tankers that are out there, and they're not.
All right, let me ask you, Anna Borshevskaya, what's the mood in Washington right now? Because again, 7 days ago, we weren't expecting this announcement from Donald Trump. And do people think that it's a serious one?
Well, this is definitely a change in how the Trump administration has approached Russia to date. It is certainly a milestone, and a number of analysts have made that comment. But from a bigger picture perspective, to the point that one of your guests has mentioned, is what does that fundamentally change, and what are our objectives? The fact of the matter is, sanctions to date have not been able to stop the war, and frankly, no one realistically expected them to. So the bigger question is, what is fundamentally going to change with this imposition of sanctions? Will Putin still be able to conduct his war? And the answer is yes, he still will be able to conduct the war. Sanctions alone have not been able to deter Putin. They have not been able to raise the costs on him significantly enough to get him to change his cost-benefit calculus. But is it a shift in Trump's approach? Sure, and that's an important step.
Why did Donald Trump do it?
I think only Donald Trump knows why he did it, but it's been pretty clear that he has been frustrated with Putin over the last almost year in dealing with him. You can see it in his comments and the way he responds. And so it is possible that he eventually concluded that he needed to shift his approach. But again, only Trump knows ultimately why he did it.
Boris Bondarev, do you agree that sanctions on oil, even if they are enforced with, again, that notion of secondary sanctions, anybody who uses U.S. dollars will also fall under sanctions, that this ultimately Vladimir Putin will find the workaround and it won't matter?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Russia has accumulated great experience in circumventing sanctions so far. So these new sanctions, however unpleasant and maybe very painful they could be, they will not be a catastrophe.
They won't be a catastrophe. What about all this talk of seizing Russian assets from the central bank and elsewhere?
Well, that I think would be more significant. And that would show the resolve, at last the resolve of European Union, at least European countries, to do some proactive steps towards ending the war, towards signaling Putin that his behavior is at last less acceptable than it has been to this day. Yeah, and then it could be used as an instrument of another way of deterrence, a financial deterrence, so to speak.
Yeah, the European Union right now of two minds when it comes to using those frozen Russian assets. Earlier we heard the Belgian Prime Minister saying, I'll only do this if all the other members have my back, because a lot of the money's parked in Belgium. So the United States also of two minds. According to the Bloomberg News Agency earlier this week, they pushed back against a coordinated effort to seize Russian assets at the G7 level. What is your religion, Ambassador Levy, when it comes to this?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be careful in terms of, legal aspects. And everybody's been working on a mechanism which will be a seizure of assets which are in Europe, by the way. They are not in the US, but which could be some sort of advance payment on reparations once Russia has to pay for all the destruction. So it's a way which doesn't seize the assets. There will be a loan, if I understand well, of something like 150 billion euros to Ukraine, and with a guarantee of the EU, and then which will be based on the assets. But if I may, perhaps to understand well, to assess well the situation, and I want to react to what you have said. I think you need to understand what is the big picture. The big question for me, having gone through all this experience in Russia and knowing the key role of the U.S., of course, and for the Russians, they say, well, at the end of the game, we'll have a deal with the U.S. For them, this is key. I think the big question is to know whether we will come from what I would call a random U.S. diplomacy.
Random U.S. diplomacy.
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of declarations, words, good words, and so on. I mean, you look at you remember the summit in Anchorage without result. To a diplomacy in which the U.S. will understand that a victory of Russia is a defeat for the U.S. and is a defeat for President Trump. Because all this, you have China behind all this. And when I was there, I saw the agenda of the Russians to de-Westernize the world, de-dollarize the Russian economy, fight against the U.S. hegemony. So my concern is that for the time being, I didn't understand exactly why in Washington they didn't understand that they have to have a real confrontation with Russia. And this element of the sanction regarding oil and gas is one element of a global response of the U.S., which I hope will come regarding military support to Ukraine, support in intelligence, because I think the priority is to have a Ukraine which is resilient and in front of a President Putin who is more and more confident.
All right, but we saw last Friday that the meeting did not go very well between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House. Turns out, though, it's not just Ukraine's president that can rub his U.S. counterpart the wrong way. When Donald Trump, as the ambassador alluded to, welcomed Vladimir Putin to Alaska back in August, the U.S. president was looking forward to some art of the deal making. But last week, the Financial Times revealed that behind closed doors, the Russian president then delivered, quote, a rambling historical discursion spanning medieval princes such as Rurik of Novgorod and Yaroslav the Wise, along with the 17th century Cossack chieftain Bohdan Khmelnytsky, figures he often cites to support his claim Ukraine and Russia are one nation. Taken aback, Trump raised his voice several times and at one point threatened to walk out, the People said. He ultimately cut the meeting short and canceled a planned lunch where broader delegations were due to discuss economic ties and cooperations. To borrow Pierre Lévy's term about random policy, so this blow-up happens, but it's not really a wake-up call, is it? Because since then, there was this offer of a summit in Budapest.
Which didn't happen. Look, Donald Trump is astonishingly ignorant about Russia and doing business with Russia. What Putin did, that historical gobbledygook, was not rambling in Putin's mind. Trump did not go into this summit with the kind of people he requires to educate him. Look at, he has dumped his two biggest, most smartest advisors, Fiona Hill and John Bolton, who he's now prosecuting on 18 counts of what amounts to espionage.
Explain why that history lesson by Vladimir Putin is not rambling.
Because he believes it, because Russian history and mysticism is central to Putin's whole core vision of what Europe should be. Ignore that, ladies and gentlemen, at your peril. At your peril. The situation that took place in Alaska, and then Trump offering a summit in, of all places, Budapest, which we won't go into why that was boneheaded, it begs a question that I'd like to ask the ambassador, if I might. Your forebearer, the Marquis de Custine, who while Alex de Tocqueville was wandering the United States writing Democracy in America.
We're going 1831.
Right. This is critically important.
Okay.
This is critically important stuff. It's not funny because Putin knows this stuff. Yeah. Okay? The audience might not, but Putin deals with this stuff on a daily basis, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so Custine does the same thing in Russia. He writes a book called Empire of the Tsar. And in that book, he says, I do not reproach the Russians for being what they are. What I blame in them is they're pretending to be what we are. Would you agree with Christine's assessment?
Well, to refer to George Kennan, eminent U.S. ambassador in the U.S., I admire him very much, and I've been head of policy planning for 5 years at the ministry. You know, he's the one who created the policy planning staff at the State Department. Yeah. And he said something about Christine. He said it was a very bad book at his time. It's a very good book at the time of the Soviet Union. You know, so it's very interesting because, of course, when you read it again, you have astonishing elements. But let me add one remark regarding the attitude of Putin. I still keep in mind the interview by Tucker Carlson, you remember, in Moscow. And it was fascinating. I was there at that time, closely taking notes. It was fascinating because Putin talked about 20 or 25 minutes about the arrival of the Vareg in 8th century in Kiev. And Tucker Carlson was astonished, and it was like a tunnel, as you would say, as a journalist. So he's very much in the past. He very much believes that time is on his side. He thinks, I'm convinced that his decision to go to war is very related to the constitutional reform in 2020, He's now allowed to stay until 2036. And so I think this idea of, to solve the Ukrainian question was far in his, since a long time in his mind. And he said, well, now it's time. I work for the legacy. I work for history. I work to have my name.
It's critically important.
So I think this is the key element which induces him to go to war. And so, of course, coming back to the sanctions, there is a lot of debate, do the sanctions work or not? The sanctions bite, and I think that it won't make him change his overall strategy, but it will make him calculate exactly the cost of the war.
Boris Bondarev, do you agree? And how much are these historical references important and misunderstood here in the West?
Well, there are more, I would say, objective reasons or grounds for this war. The questions of political survival of the Putin regime, and also very big role belongs to Vladimir Putin's personal, historical, and other political imagination. And yes, I agree that his historical views on what place Russia must take among the other countries in the world are very, very central to understand what he is doing and what are his goals. And if we take it seriously, and I think we should, it would be totally understandable that Putin is not after Donbass region. He's not after 2, 3, 4, 5 Ukrainian regions. So it will not be sufficient to give him these regions and buy Ukraine and European security out of his, grip. No, because he's not even about Ukraine. He wants to establish Russia as the stronghold of its own civilization as he sees it, impregnable. So the Western countries, which are destined to aggression, to eternal aggression against Russia as he sees it again, would not do anything. So his goal is to make the West helpless, to deprive of this threat that West countries pose to Russia, as he sees it again. So he must get from the Western countries acknowledgement that Russia is a great power, truly great power, that it has its own sphere of influence where nobody shall interfere, and then it will be okay. Then the war stops.
Anna Borshevskaya,
so when there will be no NATO, when the Europe has to trade with Putin one by one without any trans-American daddy behind, then Putin may feel satisfied.
All right, so no NATO, no European Union. Anna Borshevskaya, of course, that's not going to happen, is it? So what are your thoughts on these misunderstandings of what Donald Trump wants and what Vladimir Putin wants?
Well, while it's not going to happen, as you say, I think it is important for us to understand what Putin wants and how far he's willing to go to achieve it. Trump, unfortunately, like his predecessors, frankly, does not understand Russia. This is, he certainly puts his own unique personality on these interactions, but the West, unfortunately, has a very long history, even before Trump, of not understanding Russia and how and what it truly wants to achieve. What that means for us is we haven't clarified what our goals are and what it would take for us to achieve them. I agree with what our panelists have said in terms of Putin's worldview and what he wants to see. What that means for us is that Putin wants to see a fundamentally different world, a different world order. And that means that it is one thing to simply ensure that Ukraine does not lose, but that is not the same as ensuring that Ukraine wins. Putin's goals indeed go beyond Ukraine. This is not simply about Ukraine. And he will not be satisfied with even a ceasefire. It'll simply turn into a frozen conflict. So the bigger question is, will there be a bigger confrontation between NATO and Russia, or the West at large and Russia, because if the war drags on for as long as it does? Because certainly Putin, for his part, is pushing towards that confrontation. So I think it's important to understand what it is that the world that we're living in and where it's headed. NATO has been very careful to, for good reasons, to avoid a confrontation. But you have the other side that is pushing for that confrontation and has the resources to do it. And that's why you cited previous intelligence assessment about preparation for potential war with Russia.
Let me ask you about this, Pierre Lévy. Very important what Anna just said about frozen conflicts. When it comes to understanding Russia, we were told East German-born Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor of Germany, understood it. Her and the then French President agreed to the so-called Normandy format in a bid to freeze the conflict in 2014 to stop the guns. Do you think that the Germans and the French, and you were ambassador when Emmanuel Macron went to Moscow had to sit at that big long table when he was trying to avoid the all-out invasion. Do you think that the French and the Germans understand Russia?
Well, I think that, first of all, we had to do everything we could, to try and prevent a war. And I remember the huge tension, including in spring 2021, it doesn't come from one day to another. And I think that we have, in the French diplomacy, we have experts. And I think in Germany, too, you have very good experts of Russia. And we've been working closely with them. But I think we are on a very two different political and strategic software. And I think the problem comes from that, which is, as I explained, Vladimir Putin is very messianic. He has this historical vision. Whatever happens, I have to restore, to reinstall Russia as a big power, which creates fear. On our side, we were more rational. We are together and on the same continent. We have to work. We are together at the Security Council. We believe, Anna, that we could do something. And I still believe, having left Moscow, that this war is unnecessary. Totally, the Russians got exactly the contrary they wanted. Look, they could stop Ukraine on the Euro-Atlantic path, to freeze the conflict in the Normandy format. The question of Ukraine membership in NATO was not on the table since the Bucharest summit, and they could have ways to weaken Zelensky. So all this is totally unnecessary, and they got exactly what they didn't want for years. Strengthen NATO, enlargement of NATO, membership to to Ukraine, more unity in the Europeans, and the relation between Russia and the EU is lost for generations.
Boris Bondarev, do you agree with that? Because earlier you talked about kind of a vital necessity on the part of Vladimir Putin in having this war?
Well, I don't really see how NATO has been strengthened. I think if we listen to Mark Rutte, who says that to shoot down drones in NATO airspace is a sign of weakness, and not to shoot them down is a sign of strength, then NATO is very strong now. But I think Moscow thinks otherwise.
Wow.
Yeah, and expansion of NATO does not equal to its strengthening, or I would say the experience which we have now in most recent histories shows that the more members an alliance has, the less effective it can be, because there will be more members who do not agree with one another, right? And now we have in the heart of NATO a few countries which openly questions the basic policies of this defensive bloc.
Pierre Lévy?
So I think, sorry.
Let me bring
One more.
If I may follow the points, I think really to understand, I fully agree with many points which have been said, but I think to understand exactly what are the issues, I use in my book this image of a matryoshka conflict. The
Russian dolls.
The Russian dolls.
Yeah.
You have the smallest doll. It's about Ukraine, Donbass, and so on, the end of sovereignty. The other doll, the bigger one, is about the fight against the US, NATO, and the EU. And the biggest doll, the third one, it's about a new world order, what Putin calls multipolarity or polycentric, against the US hegemony, against to de-Westernize the world. And I even I had some contacts, people very courageous in Russia, fighting for human rights, who said to me that one objective also of Putin is to change Russia profoundly, to have some sort of social revolution, conservative revolution inside Russia. So this is much more complex than it's not about territory, it's not about Donbass only, it's much bigger than that.
Yeah.
Anna Borshevskaya, let me ask you, is it to change Russia or to bring it back to something it was before?
Good question.
Well, it might be a little bit of both, but for us, what that means for us again is really going back to the original main topics of our discussion, and that is NATO strengthened or not? Will the war widen outside Ukraine? All of these issues go back to the main point of European and Western security. The fact of the matter is, I don't think we are any more secure than we were yesterday because there are now more sanctions on Russia's energy sector. So these same questions about fundamental European security very much should concern us, that they're still on the table, and especially with with NATO, what Russia is doing now is with these drones that have flown into Polish airspace, Russia is normalizing these types of violations. And if there's no adequate response, what it's going to do is slowly erode credibility of NATO, which is a vital Western institution. And that is part of Putin's plan. In other words, you're not gonna have Russian troops storming Berlin. Instead, you're going to have these types of multi-pronged attacks that normalize the erosion of credibility and trust of these institutions.
All right, so here's the question then, and is a weakened EU, does that necessarily mean a strengthened Russia. Last month, in an article that's morbidly titled Death by Falling, the Moscow Times listed 18 cases of prominent Russians who've died after going through a window in the past 3 years. Wikipedia hosts a broader, there's the article from the Moscow Times. Wikipedia hosts a broader suspicious deaths page for the same period. It goes just beyond falling out the window. 38, the number there. The Moscow Times tally, by the way, needs an update with the death of Vyacheslav Leontiev. The 87-year-old former publisher of newspaper Pravda fell from the fifth-floor window of his Moscow apartment after what's described as a nervous breakdown. Now, some of these, of course, Wikipedia's can be suicides. Morbid jokes aside, if it is a calling card, though, by the Kremlin to the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg, what is the message?
You toe the line or you die.
And is it a sign of Putin's strength or weakness?
You're asking a Western question. I'll answer it in a Russian way, okay? He's getting rid of those who aren't supporting him. They're no longer part of what's known as the Kremlin ration. The most dangerous thing you can do is analyze what goes on in Russia through a Western lens. It's death. You take, for example, I believe what Anna was pointing out, I think quite properly as well. Last time I won a bet, $300, was in November of 2015. When Tayyip Erdogan splashed that Russian Sukhoi jet with an F-15, and everyone thought, oh, they're going to invade Turkey. Putin ran and hid under the nearest rug. Putin is a bully and a chicken. You need to respond to these people. This is the issue. And what you have, as Paolo was saying, is the Europeans understand Russia. I've known European diplomats and experts in Russia since the 80s. You know your stuff. The problem is you're being led by the Americans. And Trump has neither the intelligence, the education, nor the support staff to grasp what's really happening there and lead a cogent and coherent system to take out Putin and bring peace to Ukraine. That is an essential key problem that I don't see a solution to. You're not going to end this with sanctions. It ain't going to happen.
All right, none of the panelists here are, of course, inside of Russia right now, so we're on the outside looking in, and we're reading what's being said by those who look from the outside. Writing for the Carnegie Russia Center think tank, senior fellow Tatiana Stanovaya wrote a piece last week claiming Russia's system is beginning to eat its own. She, for instance, points to the routing of the political clan of the once powerful former defense minister Sergei Shoigu. And she goes on to say that, traditional forms of political protection are no longer reliable and are being closed. Being close to an influential figure no longer a guarantee of being able to, for instance, avoid arrest if you're suddenly accused of corruption. Boris Bondarev, is the system inside of Moscow more solid than ever, or is there trouble?
There are always troubles, and there are always mechanisms in place to cope with these troubles. And of course, now the stress is growing bigger. People are falling out of the windows, as you mentioned, somehow. And of course, there is a need to discipline those who may think something that is not in line with what Vladimir Putin and his close entourage think. But the message that it is not now safe to be close to a prominent figure, well, it's always been like that. And in the past also, some people who were considered to be untouchable were touched quite effectively, but maybe not as much as today. But I think it's a logic, of course. The country is in war. It needs more discipline inside, and discipline must be maintained at all costs. And of course, there is also still pie. Pie is still enormous, but it gets no more portions. So people must limit the appetites. Who cannot limit the appetites according to the party line, they will be excluded. And we see it.
All right, there is a discipline in the inner circle. Ordinary Russians are feeling the pinch. We can show you an example from Chelyabinsk in the Ural Mountains. An explosion at a military plant. 4 killed. Local authorities. There's no evidence of drone activity. We saw on Wednesday Russia's military command. There's the pictures from the Ural Mountains. Russia's military command Wednesday announced the use of reservists to protect critical infrastructure like oil installations that have been the target of Ukrainian drone strikes. And for its fall recruitment drive, the Russian Ministry of Defense publishing images of brand new conscripts taking part in a military roll call ceremony, this in the Crimean port of Sevastopol. And since it's for the cameras, listen up, here's an important caveat.
Our guys are heading to the military units on the territory of the Russian Federation, to the sites of permanent location. They will not be involved in this special military operation.
They're not for the special military operation. At what point does it become a problem, all the death, the dead and wounded inside of Russia?
Well, I'm not sure that the people know the amount of losses, because the figures we have in the West, they are not published in Russia. But when you travel in Russia, or you look at social networks, you see fresh graves. You see a lot of there is a lot of information, or networks like Insider. They got a lot of experience counting the death through the COVID. But it's very surreal when you live in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, because they still talk about the SVO, special military operation, more and more about the war. But you don't see much about the war. You see only placards to recruit people. But to come back to the precedent question, I think a lot of people in Russia around the governing circles have interest to carry on the war, because you have oligarchs who buy cheap assets, cheap Western assets, and then you have a way to manage the power. Let me take the example, if I have time, of Shoigu. Shoigu,
the former defense minister.
The former minister of defense. They never fire or expel. Shoigu has been recycled at the Security Council, even if
there's been a purge of his inner circle.
Yes, but has been recycled. Even if Prigozhin, remember Prigozhin, he was very right, saying that all the system is corrupted, the war is a catastrophe, and so on. I remember, and this is the first time I saw Putin worried about that. But they don't fire Shoigu; they recycle him in the at the Security Council. He's loyal, and this is the way the system works. To keep the people in some sort of dependency, or to get rid of them, or to kill them.
Is there a tipping point, or there is no tipping point where at one point they're no longer loyal?
It's been this way since Ivan the Terrible.
No, I'm very humble in that respect. You hear a lot. This is a black box. Yeah. You don't know what is inside. Sometimes you learn that a senior official has resigned, like Kazak, who was a very important man at the presidential administration. You don't really know. This is a very difficult game to understand. And, classically in the Russian history, perhaps you wake up one morning and you discover that, something has changed.
All right. Well, until it does, everything stays the same for now. Pierre Lévy, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank as well Craig Kopidis, Boris Bondarev for being with us from Geneva, Anna Borchevskaya from Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.